So this is going to be something I haven't ever done before, but I watched this video and I was so inspired, I just felt like I had to make a commentary on the video live, watching it right now and commentating as it's happening, because this video was so weird to me that I just felt I needed to say something about it. And I have just watched Watchmen, the movie, for the first time a couple weeks ago after having watched the TV series for the first time ever. And then I watched this movie. That's just context. Now let's go.
Oh, it's you again. Well, since you're here, allow me to regale you with another story from the annals of cinema history. When it comes to controversial movie directors that are still working today, it's tough to think of one more divisive and contentious than Zack Snyder.
That's true. I don't really like a lot of his movies, and this movie did not change my opinion on him.
Depending on who you talk to, the man's either a visual genius who helped to usher in a unique new cinematic style for comic book adaptations, or a talentless
And a lot of slow-mo. His movies, the few I've seen, oh my god, they are just riddled with slow-motion action scenes that just drag the movie out.
Hack, whose movies look like they were shot in the middle of a power
I also just watched Batman vs. Superman.
cut. Whereas the iconic shots of 300 really put him on the map, the grim, somber and depressing tone of Man of Steel and Batman vs. Superman
Both not great.
practically knocked him off it. But there's another Zack Snyder movie that's a bit more difficult to categorize.
No, it's not. It's bad.
A movie that dared to tackle source material so challenging that it frustrated some of the best writers and producers in Hollywood for decades.
Decades. Sure.
A movie named Watchmen.
So, just to be clear, from the angle I'm looking at this video from, is that just because a movie might have had a good idea doesn't make it a good movie for trying to wrestle with that idea. If your execution is bad, then the movie's bad, and I don't care how cool the idea was.
Based off the labyrinthine and extremely mature comic book series, Watchmen tells the story of a group of former crime fighters living in an alternate 1980s America, poised on the brink of nuclear war. With a cast of flawed, morally questionable characters.
I guess that's semi-true. The comedian is just an actual criminal. He just brutalizes anyone who he wants to. He doesn't really have a moral compass.
Doing distinctly unheroic things to reach their goal, it dared to ask the question, if superheroes could exist, would you really want them to? Watchmen copped a lot of shit when it came out back in 2009.
I think The Boys captures that narrative a lot better. I think the show The Boys on Amazon captures the, if superheroes were real, what would it look like? And I think attacking that from a capitalist viewpoint is much more probabilistic than just having a whole bunch of people who operate outside the laws, these vigilantes.
Fans of the original comic series were somehow surprised that a 2.5-hour movie wasn't able to incorporate every single element from the 450-page graphic novel.
No shit.
General audiences, on the other hand,
Although it did manage to be almost 3 hours long, and it was full of a lot of useless bull crap.
went into theaters expecting a fun, action-packed superhero flick about a bunch of good guys out to save the world. And well, that's not exactly what they got.
Oh, hold on. Before we continue, I just want to close something really quick. Just so it doesn't accidentally ping.
As a result, Watchmen failed to generate enough momentum to break through at the box office. Combined with lukewarm reviews from journalists, remember when people still cared what they thought? It gained a reputation.
Wow, nice attack. Yeah, let's just attack journalism as a industry, not as, like, anything coherent. Oh yeah, I hate journalism with their opinions.
As a bit of a critical and commercial failure. But was it really? Well, it's not like I can go back and fudge the box office numbers. What do you think I am, Disney? But I can take a closer look at Watchmen as a creative endeavour and try to answer the age-old question, was it really that bad? Now, the theatrical cut is over 2.5 hours long, so needless to say, the story is a bit of a fucking monster, and if I tried to break down every single plot point...
I will say this. Only by watching the show did I appreciate that little scene of, like, the first generation of superheroes. So, I guess that was cool to see in the movie.
Then this review would probably end up longer than Mahler's TFA series. But I'll do my best to give you a decent overview of the story. So let's begin, shall we?
I'm ready to bet, even though I've already watched this, so spoiler alerts, it's a little biased.
Watchmen takes place in an alternate 1985 America, where masked crime fighters have been around since the 1940s. At least they were, until they got outlawed a few years earlier after a wave of public backlash. Now the few that remain have either retired to live out their lives as normal people, become government agents, or ignored the ban and continued to operate outside the law.
Like criminals.
Meanwhile, the accidental creation of a godlike being known as Dr. Manhattan has allowed Richard Nixon...
Wait, I just realized. Was that an unblurred penis in my YouTube video? Uh-oh.
...to win the Vietnam War and a third term in office, not to mention shifting the balance of the Cold War in favour of America. Backed into a corner, the Soviets are becoming increasingly desperate and unpredictable, pushing the world to the brink of Armageddon. The main...
Mutually assured destruction is a real thing, and for better or for worse, it's kind of what we're operating under now. There's so many nukes, we'll just destroy the whole world 10 times over, and... guess it's working if you want to live in a state of perpetual panic.
Storyline kicks off with the murder of an elderly crime fighter known as the Comedian,
who, in my opinion, if this was a world with any justice, that the Comedian would have been tried for basically war crimes and vigilante brutality, because the Comedian throughout the movie is just an awful human being.
Attracts the attention of his former comrade Rorschach,
also an awful person.
Named because of the ink blot mask that he wears to hide his identity. Believing that former members of the Watchmen crime-fighting group are being targeted for assassination, Rorschach tries to contact the others and warn them. This is where we get to meet the other main characters of the story. There's Night Owl, who used to be a Batman-type character with a badass suit and a hoverjet.
Night Owl is probably the least bad character, but he's still pretty boring and poorly written. Ugh, he doesn't have a whole lot going on for him, and I don't think this video is going to discuss it, but there's basically one point when he looks straight at the camera and says, after Night Spectre girl put on his night vision goggles, he says some really bogus line of, you know, sometimes in the darkness, you need to find the light. Or some bullcrap like that. I'm like, really? You're just going to stare directly at the camera and say some top-level, superficially deep sentiment that really means nothing?
But now he's fat and retired
pretty cringe.
And kind of a pussy. Ozymandias, on the other hand, has used his scientific genius to become a billionaire tech giant, hoping to use science to avert a nuclear war.
I did like Ozymandias, and I only liked him because I thought he was so well portrayed in the television show. I think it gave me bias to like his character in this movie prematurely.
And there's Dr. Manhattan himself, who now works as an agent of the US government, along with his girlfriend Silk Spectre. Manhattan's abilities allow him to experience the universe outside of linear time, meaning that his mind basically exists in the past, present, and future all at once.
Also, extremely well executed on in the show. The way they showed in the show how this works, it was super cool. I think it was the best I've ever seen portrayed as something like that in media.
As you can probably imagine, this makes it pretty hard for him to focus on little things like the outcome of the Cold War, and there's a growing rumour that he may actually be a threat to humanity. This all comes to a head during a disastrous TV interview where he tries to reassure the public, only to be confronted by a former lover that claims he gave her a terminal illness. Overwhelmed by all the attention, he teleports himself to the surface of Mars for some downtime. But with America...
If I recall correctly, in the movie, he definitely was causing a lot of problems for everyone around him.
Because ultimate weapon missing in action...
Oh, by the way, this is what I'm talking about, Zack Snyder, with your horrible slow-mo scenes that are just ridiculous. Like, the premise is that everyone that's not Dr. Manhattan is not a superhero. The premise is they're all, like, average people with just above average, like, assets. And this scene right here is out of control, if that's the narrative you're pushing.
The Soviets used the opportunity to invade Afghanistan, bringing the world even closer to World War III. Meanwhile, just as Rorschach's getting closer to the truth of the comedian's death, he's framed for the murder of a former supervillain and sent to prison for it. Knowing he'll be dead within hours if they don't do something, Night Owl and Silk Spectre are...
Yeah, and this guy, he's very cool. He just... They didn't show it there, but he was just using a saw blade to saw someone's arms off right in front of him. Yeah, I mean, you know, he's probably well-adjusted. He's probably fine. I don't see an issue.
Are forced to come out of retirement to rescue him. That's the three basic strands to Watchmen's story. The first follows the growing
The reason I said that, it's an important tool that will help us later.
relationship between Night Owl and Silk Spectre as they dust off their capes and costumes for the first time in years. The second follows Rorschach's search for the truth and his growing suspicion.
Rorschach definitely should have been tried for his crimes, because he did horrible things.
That there's a much bigger conspiracy at work. And the third centers on Dr. Manhattan, trying to decide whether humanity even deserves to be saved. In between all this, we get flashbacks
The worst character, by the way.
to the defining events of each character's life over the previous decades, most of which center around the comedian and his gradual transformation from honorable crime fighter
Never honorable.
to bloodthirsty warrior
Always that.
to cynical and embittered old man. He's like the bridge that spans the different generations of superheroes, from the innocent optimism of the 1940s to the turbulence and disillusionment of the 70s.
Wow, what a hero. He's just attacking protesters. By the way, the reason I really wanted to talk about this video, it seems very topical that you have a character, the comedian, acting outside the law, like paramilitary, private military corporations, attacking protesters. But in this case, in real life, the protesters don't attack back. They defend themselves non-violently because they don't want to get murdered by guys with flamethrowers and shotguns, as that happens in the movie. He literally, in this scene, takes a shotgun out and just starts gunning people down. Like, wow, what a morally gray character. He either burns Asian people alive in wartime, or he's killing protesters for peace. Wow. How morally complex.
And finally to the grim foreboding of the 80s, where there are no heroes anymore, and the world stands on the brink of annihilation, with nobody left to pull it back. He also gets one of the best lines in the entire movie.
Let's see if it's good.
What happened to the American dream? What happened to the American dream? It came true. You're looking at it.
He says, and in the immediate previous scene to this, he guns down protesters. And there's a guy, I'm pretty sure if I recall correctly, behind him on that wall, who he just shot in the back. It wasn't clear if it was a beanbag gun or an actual shotgun though, so I guess kudos to him. He only used semi-lethal force.
As the main characters eventually join forces...
It's also a super hollow line. That means nothing. You're looking at him, this is the American dream, some guy who just guns down civilians. Ooh.
To uncover the truth, they learn that the comedian's death was part of something much bigger and more sinister than a simple assassination, and that one of their own may in fact be working against them. And with the doomsday clock ticking down to midnight, they discover that the price of saving the world could be higher than any of them ever imagined. Now, when I think about Watchmen's relative failure at the box office, I can't shake the feeling that it was, at heart, a badly marketed film. Anyone who went into this movie expecting a traditional, upbeat comic book flick where the hero defeats the bad guy and saves the world is gonna come away from Watchmen feeling pretty disappointed.
That's a fair point. I will give him that. Like, if you went into this thinking... Wait, hold on. Let's take a quick peek. When did Iron Man come out? 2008. Yeah, that's fair, right? Like, we get a new movie. Granted, The Incredible Hulk came first, but that movie was so bad I couldn't even finish it. But immediately before Watchmen, a year before, you get Iron Man, and you're like, oh, this is, like, a fun movie with, like, you know, not like the nicest protagonist, but he's like a decent enough guy. He kills the villain in the end. So like I will give the Critical Drinker this. Like that is a very fair assessment.
It's simply not that kind of movie because it was never meant to be. Look beneath the flashy visuals, and Watchmen is a
Flashy,
complex
slow-mo,
film that explores interesting aspects of the superhero genre. I'm kind of hesitant to use the word deconstruction because these days it conjures up images of angry, purple-haired land whales that think their gender studies degree is a magical key to unlock the mysteries of complex storytelling. But in this case,
that was pretty cringe, bro. Wow. Anyone? Hold on. I need to rehear that.
Film. Anyone who went into this movie expecting a traditional, upbeat comic book flick where the hero defeats the bad guy and saves the world is gonna come away from Watchmen feeling pretty disappointed. It's simply not.
Here it is.
Not that kind of movie because it was never meant to be. Look beneath the flashy visuals, and Watchmen is a complex film that explores interesting aspects of the superhero genre. I'm kind of hesitant to use the word deconstruction because these days it conjures up images.
Deconstruction is going to conjure up these following images
of angry, purple-haired land whales that think their gender studies degree is a magical key to unlock the mysteries of complex.
What straw man argument is that? My desire to deconstruct a movie and see its individual points and how those points contribute to the overall narrative necessitates that I be a morbidly obese, purple-haired land whale? It's kind of cringe, bro. Like, and even if that were true, okay, so let's say that I am a purple-haired land whale. Does that mean my opinions on film, like, can't be valid? It's kind of a really weird insult. And we know who that was targeting. That was targeting the left. Everyone, we all know who he was looking at there.
Storytelling. But in this case, it really is the best way to describe what Watchmen does. It's a movie that's not afraid to challenge our conventions and assumptions about superheroes. It tells a complex, multi-layered story spanning decades, with characters that represent vastly...
It basically only focuses on one timeline. It does not... It doesn't really bounce around that much.
Differing ideas and worldviews, and it does this in a patient, detailed, and methodical way.
No, it doesn't. It's actually very, very poorly paced. Like, there are so many moments in this movie that are just so drawn out. Like, don't get me wrong. I love in movies when it lets a moment linger. No dialogue, no action. Something happens and the camera just sets on that character and you let it sink in. I like that when it's done well. In this movie, there are so many drawn out scenes that just feel like padding for time. And it's so strange because this movie is nearly 3 hours long. It doesn't need to pad. I don't need slow-mo action scenes. It's not methodical at all. At least no method that I enjoyed.
Laying the groundwork for the big emotional payoffs that come later. It takes the time to build up the history of its world and the characters that live.
It does okay. He's not wrong.
In it, giving us big, elaborate flashbacks to previous groups and events, whose connection to the main story only becomes clear much later. Like seeing a young version of the comedian trying to rape the first Silk Spectre back in the 90s.
Oh, this part is cringe. This part is super cringe. In the movie, like, at least he called it rape. Like, she said no, slapped him, pushed him away, and he's like, well, I want to rape you now, so here it comes. Like, at least he called it what it was. I appreciate that.
40s. A scene like this might seem like a pointless detour into self-indulgent territory until
I don't know what that means.
Realize that not only does it establish the darker side of the comedian's personality,
he is an evil person,
but it also gets put into an entirely different context later when you find out that Silk Spectre actually fell in love with him despite his flaws.
That scene never sat well with me. That is written like some weird misogynist view of like what women want. Women just want the bad guy who treats them like trash. That's what women want. They love that. Like, no. And then the movie does try to justify it, which is pretty cringe, if you ask me. Like, yeah, he tried to rape me, but I realized there was more to him than just that. And I guess one thing led to another, and I fell in love with him. You can't one thing led to another. you're a rapist into that. Like, you have to explain that. And I highly doubt you're gonna make it work. Like, no, this was some weird incel fantasy of, like, what women want. And this was not it.
Even having a child with him. A child whose unlikely conception ultimately helps Dr. Manhattan to rediscover his humanity. Just like a watch mechanism, even the smallest piece has a role to play. Every scene and flashback sheds a bit more light on the events that brought us here, providing...
Yeah, every flashback makes the comedian look even worse. And, I mean, maybe this isn't intentional, but he is making me now think about, like, cops justifying covering for each other's bad behavior, which is topical for what's going on right now. Like, you have someone who is the bad apple in the bunch, and everyone else just is like, oh, well, yeah, can't do anything. Like, where are these other heroes? There's a scene in this video he'll touch on, and I'll talk more when he gets there.
Into the film's cast of flawed, morally ambiguous characters. And
they're mostly all monsters.
This is another aspect of Watchmen that I really have to give the movie credit for. Most of Watchmen's characters are neither good nor bad. They all act according to their own worldview, and whether or not you can...
Yeah, it's so weird that this guy loves the comedian, who is, like, objectively the worst. And then Rorschach. Well, oh, don't worry. He has a great line about Rorschach. Oh, I can't wait for it.
Consider them heroes or villains depends very much on your own perspective. Rorschach, for example, is a violent vigilante operating outside the law.
True.
Ruthlessly pursuing his investigation with no regard for anyone caught in his path.
True.
He's extremely conservative in his view of the world, openly despising liberals, homosexuals, prostitutes, drug users, or anyone who strays off a righteous path.
There's a lot to unpack right there. He's a conservative. He hates liberals, homosexuals, prostitutes, drug users, and anyone who strays off the righteous path. I just want to point out, like, I did watch this movie, and I am married to a man, and I always watch in media for homophobic dog whistling or remarks. Unless I missed it, which is entirely possible. I could have missed it in Watchmen. I don't want to watch it again. It's way too long. But I would have tried to catch if Rorschach was making some F-slur remarks in this movie. I didn't catch that. There was a scene where a prostitute tried to proposition him for money. He said no, and she goes, screw you. Like, okay. Like, I don't think that means, like, he hates prostitutes and, like, they have strayed from the righteous path. I just saw him as, like, an asexual character who only has his driving goals. Like, it's so weird that Critical Drinker has read into this as him being conservative, anti-liberal, anti-gay, anti-degenerate policy, when I didn't even see that in the movie, but it's kind of weird that this guy, like, role-played that into him and put that on him as a character. Like, what are you trying to say? Do you hate these people? Critical Drinker? Do you hate the liberals, homos, prostitutes, and drug users? Because we can have that discussion, and there's a lot more there.
He's a man of deep principle and conviction, molded by a harsh and unforgiving life, and he sees the world purely in terms of right and wrong, black and white, if you will. Compared to the others, he's not particularly big or physically strong. He's not super smart, and he doesn't have any powers or gadgets. He's just a tough, tenacious little bastard, ready and willing to take on guys twice his size without any fear or
Wow, how brave.
hesitation, ready to fight dirty and use any advantage he can find. Like when this guy tries to confront him in prison. Doesn't end too well for him, though.
I mean, like, this was a cool scene. He was gonna get shanked. Like, this guy had a shank. He was gonna shank him. Because the context is that Rorschach put, like, 80% of these prisoners into this prison. So that's why they all want to get him.
Rorschach is a man who lives by a strict moral code and won't break it for any reason, even at
That was the prostitute, by the way.
the cost of personal friendships or his own life. He represents unbending willpower, and his philosophy is perfectly summed up in this line.
In that scene, he was about to go tell the world that Ozymandias had caused the nuclear explosion in New York in order to save the world from mutually assured destruction.
Never compromise.
Never compromise.
In the face of Armageddon.
See, the thing is, though, that line is said by someone we're not supposed to respect. Like, a not good moral person said, never compromise, even in the face of Armageddon. Like, what? What is that message? Like, oh, okay, the world is in a state of mutually assured destruction. Like, these two superpowers want to go at it and end the world just to get each other. Like, that's the implication, right? The US versus the Soviets. And Rorschach comes in and says, you should never compromise, even in the face of Armageddon. It's like, no! That's like when you should compromise the most. Like, these two nations should work together to stop nuclear holocaust. They should denuclearize each other. Like, if the crazy bad person is saying something, the implication should be that you don't listen to that thing.
On the other end of the spectrum, you've got the comedian who has no real morals or principles to live by.
He's just a narcissist nihilist. Like, no, he's a hedon. He's full hedonism.
Treats everyone around him like shit, openly abuses his powers, and seems resigned to the looming threat of nuclear war. But at one point, confronted by the truth of what's about to happen...
Oh, this opening combat scene where the comedian gets screwed up, it's so awful. Oh my god. It could have been like a 40-second fight scene. It takes minutes just because of all the slow-mo. Oh, it's awful.
He breaks down and acknowledges his own failings and mistakes. He's an old man now, brooding over...
He doesn't acknowledge his failings and mistakes. He's just drunkenly sitting on the bed of a mob boss, just spouting off nonsense. It's very weird.
...over a wasted life. Dr. Manhattan, on the other hand, is so disconnected from the world that he sees the survival of humanity as a simple intellectual problem, rather than something he actually cares about on a deeper level. Like in this flashback, when the
True enough.
comedian guns down a pregnant woman who attacks him.
Okay. This pregnant woman said, hey, you impregnated me when you first got to Vietnam several months ago. The baby is yours. Please do something about it. And he says, no, screw you, I don't have to, the war's over. And she does crack a glass. I guess that's the justification she needed to die. Like, you have this super guy, and he's like, well, she had a glass bottle. It was time for her to die. Like, no. Like, you can't just be like, oh yeah, this pregnant woman attacks him. Like, no. There's context there, please give it.
Only to point out that Dr. Manhattan could have prevented the whole thing if he wanted. Instead, he chose to do nothing. That says a lot about where his head's at. Ultimately...
True. That part's true. Dr. Manhattan could have and should have done it. I would argue that if you have the power to do morally just things, you should do those things. Like, Jeff Bezos has billions of dollars. He should do things to help poor people. Like, I think he has the moral obligation.
The character is there to pose an interesting question.
Gross.
If you give a man the powers of a god, what will that actually do to his humanity? Night Owl and Silk Spectre round out the main cast, and for what it's worth, they're probably the most well-adjusted of the bunch. Both are retired at the start
Also
of
terrible.
the movie. One's living a life of luxury and privilege as the girlfriend of Dr. Manhattan. The other is a timid, overweight bookworm who spends his days reminiscing with the first owner of the Night Owl name. But both of them are frustrated and unfulfilled because their lives lack purpose and meaning now. A dinner date
The only purpose my life has is to beat up criminals. Ugh.
quickly turns somber as they realize there really isn't much to look forward to anymore. It's
Get a hobby!
only when they're forced to suit up again that they start to come alive, and the adrenaline rush of beating the shit out of some criminals reignites their physical relationship. And you're left to wonder, are they really doing this for the right reasons? Or are they just two aging crime fighters trying to recapture their glory days?
Yes!
On that subject, one of the threads running through this movie is the idea of youthful idealism gradually giving way to cynicism and disenchantment as characters are forced to make way for the next generation. Like the first Silk Spectre, who becomes an embittered drunk, yearning for her younger days. Or
I think she was, like, supposed to represent, like, the bad parts. Like, she's the result of abuse of the system, the corrupt system they're operating under. Like, she is not... Calling her an old drunk seems an awfully reductionist about, like, her character.
Or Dr. Manhattan's former girlfriend, who he literally traded in for a younger model. Or even the first Night Owl,
Fairly
who wrote
true.
a scathing autobiography exposing the darker side of masked crime fighters. Watchmen doesn't just ask questions about what happens when flawed and unworthy people are given the mantle of hero, it also explores what becomes of those people when they have to hang up their capes for the last time.
And these masked people, the show actually does a really good job of, like, touching on, like, what... When you get to wear a mask, you get to kind of do what you want. Like, you're not beholden to anyone if no one knows who you are. If you get to act with anonymity, you get to do and say whatever you want. I mean, look at 4chan and even to a degree Twitter. Like, if you're on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, and you can say all sorts of horribly racist, awful things, and it's fine.
Facing up to their autumn years in the knowledge that their best days are long behind them. But the biggest and most interesting revelations are saved for the finale, when our heroes converge on the enemy stronghold.
It's kind of how storytelling works.
To confront the movie's villain at the 11th hour and foil his plans for world domination.
Whoa.
Except this particular villain isn't out to dominate the world, he's out to save it. And there's...
I will say, like I said before, I like the idea of Ozymandias, and obviously I don't agree, right, with, like, let's kill 3 million people to save the world, to potentially save the world. We're gonna sacrifice 3 million people to potentially save the world. That's his gambit. And, like, that is a utilitarian way of looking at it. Pure utilitarian. And I think it's an actually good representation of looking at things in a purely utilitarian way is not always the morally just way of doing it. It's a trolley problem. He trolley problemed this movie. It's why it's kind of like the trolley problem paradox, right? Like, he chose to kill 3 million people in New York in order to try to avert nuclear holocaust.
There's no chance of foiling his plans here. There's no last-second reprieve like we've seen a million times before.
I did like that. Like, the superheroes bust in, Ozymandias, we're gonna stop you. And he's like, I did it 30 minutes ago, dude. You're too late.
By the time they track him down, he's already put his plan into action, and even Dr. Manhattan's intervention isn't enough to stop him. It's a scene that's both surprising and refreshing, and you're left to wonder what the hell happens next.
I agree with the critical twinkle here. That was good. It was good writing. Like, ha! You heroes, my countdown clock is over there. It has 30 seconds left.
Just like Thanos a decade later, Ozymandias can be seen as the tragic anti-hero of Watchmen's story.
But Thanos was still wrong. He's still a villain. He's not an anti-hero. He's a villain. You can't kill half the universe and be like, well, I guess he had a point. He was still wrong.
A smart, logical, pragmatic man forced to do the unthinkable to save the world from total destruction.
Showing that pragmatism is not always the right way to go. You can't look at it purely by the numbers.
Sacrificing millions of innocent lives in order to save billions more.
Maybe he was gambling on that. That was not a guarantee. There was no thing that said, if you kill these 3 million people, we will avert nuclear Armageddon. He just put the world in a stalemate status quo situation.
And uniting the entire world against a common enemy by framing Dr. Manhattan for the whole thing. Peace founded on a dark lie, but peace all the same. The question is it enough? As much as they hate to admit it, even the heroes come to recognize the wisdom of his plan.
They just can't do anything about it now. Now if they out him, like, they guarantee that his plan doesn't work, and all those 3 million people died for nothing. It's still a villainous action.
You understand, don't you? Without condoning or condemning.
Man, it's nice to see Ozymandias being treated with respect and reverence
He's gonna do something bad
here, instead of turned into the butt of a fucking unfunny joke. Fuck.
So, no, that scene is highly taken out of context. The context of this scene was, spoiler alert for the show, Ozymandias had already perfected the perfect sequence of events in order to get himself off Europa. He was abandoned on Europa by Dr. Manhattan. He thought he was going to paradise. He was basically in purgatory. So he concocted the perfect plan, and through a series of events, it led him to that moment where he was on trial, and his plan had already been perfected. He didn't need to do anything else. The whole point of that scene, the fart joke that it was, it could have maybe been done better, but it was to show that it didn't matter anymore. Ozymandias had won. He had gotten what he wanted. He knew how to escape the terraformed Europa built by Dr. Manhattan. That's what that scene meant. Ozymandias is still extremely smart and clever in the show. That scene showed that he had already won. Like the movie!
Fuck off, Damon Lindelof, you useless hack. It's a brilliant resolution to the overarching threat of annihilation that perfectly encapsulates everything this movie's been trying to say. That in the real world, there are no easy, comfortable answers. There are no clear heroes and villains. No simple choice between right
Yeah, you don't just get to murder millions of people and be like, well, maybe he had a point.
and wrong. There are just people, flawed and weak and human, trying to make the best choices they can. And this, for me, is what makes Watchmen such a clever, complex, satisfying movie.
As I said at the beginning, you don't get points for a good idea that is poorly executed. This movie was poorly executed. It wasn't above people's heads. Like, people understood it at the time. I think it's 50% Rotten Tomatoes or whatever it got. I think that's very justified. It was very... Like, it had some good ideas, but the dialogue was pretty stiff. The actors weren't that great. Like, the actor who played Ozymandias was really good. But, like, you don't get points for a good idea that's crap.
It doesn't provide easy answers or neat resolutions, but instead it asks difficult questions that lesser movies would have shied away from. What does a man lose if he gains the power of a god? How do people control their darker impulses when they've been...
Yeah, by the way, that was the pregnant woman he killed, right? Like, wow. She was really a threat in that moment.
freed from responsibility?
No.
And are humans only capable of working together when they have a common enemy to strive against?
Code Geass, the anime, addressed this question much better than this movie.
These are interesting questions,
Sorry, I didn't mean to show my weeaboo power level.
and I'm glad the movie has...
Oh, there it was! There it was! He shot a guy with his back to him on the wall! That was right before he delivered the best line of the movie. I am America's dream. Yeah. Killing protesters for peace. What a hero.
balls to ask them. It's not all perfect, of course. While the grim, dark, foreboding atmosphere of the comic is perfectly conveyed here, and it's clear that some shots were literally taken right off the page, the endless rain and gloom can be kinda monotonous at times. And
True, I agree with the critical drinker here. It was very monochrome. Monotone? The color scheme was very samey throughout the movie. It felt like when they do the thing when anything happens in Mexico, everything is orange for some reason. That's how it felt here. Everything was like blue. Ugh.
some of the nuclear war references are a bit on the nose. Like, do we really need to hear 99 Red Balloons playing twice?
Agree here. Good point.
Does everything need to reference the blood-covered smiley face pointing at 5 to midnight
No.
on the Doomsday Clock? The movie also omits a lot of details and subplots from the graphic novel, for obvious reasons. If you're trying to condense a 450-page story into about 150 pages of actual script, then clearly some stuff needs to go. The Ultimate Edition actually fixes many of these issues, and it even adds in the Tales of the Black Freighter content, but the result is a movie that's well over 3 hours long.
Not worth it.
It's up to you if you consider that a worthy trade-off. Long, grim, and dark it might be, but I think Watchmen does a pretty decent job of capturing the essence of the comic, getting across the same ideas, even if it does it in a more streamlined way. And I'm just gonna say it, this is the kind of movie that Zack Snyder was born to direct.
Ooh.
Why they thought he was the right guy to do a Superman flick is beyond me.
He's not good at either.
Watchmen is well within his directorial comfort zone, and it shows. Overall then, while it may not be to everyone's taste, I genuinely think Watchmen is a decent stab at bringing some pretty challenging source material to the big screen. It's a movie that's not afraid to give us a complex, morally grey, thought-provoking story with equally
And very poorly executed.
complex characters, delivering on both style and substance. And for that reason, it gets a solid recommendation from the drinker.
No. No.
Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.
Yeah, overall, pretty bad. The movie was bad, and I think the hot take on this movie was even worse. I think the worst part was saying how, like, Rorschach was anti-leftism, and that if you have a degree in gender studies, then you are unable to review movies. I don't understand why I have to have a movie reviewing degree in order to, like, appreciate a movie. This movie, as the movie itself, independent of this review, is not a good movie, in my opinion. You can't say it's an objectively bad movie, but I will say it is very long, too long for my opinion, and with too many drawn-out fight scenes, and just really poorly executed characters. I don't think this movie deserves to be praised for its ideas and complexity when the execution is terrible. I think that Ozymandias was, like, potentially the best character, but you don't see too much of him, and you just don't get points for that, in my opinion. That you tried to say, like, well, trolley problem, the world will kill 3 million now, save billions later. But it was very poorly made, and overall, I think this hot take, it was really that bad, to answer your question, Critical Drinker. And I am concerned about your kind of right-leaning takes about what is morally acceptable in this movie. But yeah, that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now!